Welcome, everyone. This is our second information session for the Meadow Housing Project. And we have a presentation for you that will be followed by a Q&A session. We're going to be keeping track of questions in the chat, and then we will share that as well as the video from this session after we're done. So first, some introductions. I'm Terry Harding. I'm the project manager for House Bill 2001, also known as the Middle Housing Code Project. I'm the principal planner for the long range planning team, and I've worked for the city for 15 years. I'm excited to be here, and I'll have Sophie introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being with us this rainy October afternoon. I'm Sophie McGinley. My pronouns are she and her. I'm an assistant planner with community planning and design. I've been with the city for about 2.5 years, and I'm the public engagement lead for the Middle Housing Project. And I'll pass it over to Jeff.
Thanks, Sophie. My name is Jeff Gepper. I'm senior planner on the short range planning team, and I'm here for technical expertise on the draft code. And I will hand it off to Jen Knapp.
Hey, I'm Jennifer Knapp, and I'm an urban designer, and I've been with the city for about 10 years.
Awesome. Thanks, team. We also have a couple of planning commissioners here in attendance. They're just here listening. The Planning Commission's public hearing, as some of you might know, is scheduled for November 16th. So that's when you'll get to give your comments directly to the commission, but I'm glad they're here today to hear some of the questions that people have. So the next slide is our shared agreements for this meeting. We ask that you please keep yourself on mute until called upon. Put your questions in the chat and staff will moderate those questions at the end. One person should speak at a time. Please use respectful language. Try to keep your questions to under a minute if we invite you to unmute and ask a question live, and then save your comments for the public hearing. Of course, you may make comments, but our purpose for the meeting today is to answer questions that you have to help you prepare your comments for the public hearing. Next slide. Great. So this project, House Bill 2001, passed the state legislature in 2019. It effectively eliminates single-family only zoning in large cities across Oregon, and it's known as the Middle Housing Bill. It has a deadline of June 30th, 2022, and a set of administrative rules and a model code that are in place and were developed by the state. This kind of section of the presentation is some background, and then we'll get into the public involvement process and what's in the draft code and how to get involved. So what is single-family zoning? As some of you may know, single-family zoning refers to areas of the city that allow only one detached house per plot of land. As University of Oregon Law School professor Sarah Adams Shane and others have documented, single-family zoning has exclusionary roots and has created inequities in who has access to large parts of our communities. To move forward, we must first look back and acknowledge actions in the past that have harmed and excluded members of our community. Single-family zoning has a complex history that resulted in exclusion of low-income, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color from certain neighborhoods. In Oregon, this history was especially harmful, with direct exclusion of non-white people from the state from 1844 until 1926. Although those exclusions are illegal today, their negative impacts are still affecting our community through the legacy of exclusionary zoning. Housing policy and code changes are an opportunity to mitigate those. This slide shows, this is the zoning map for the city of Eugene. And as you can see, the light yellow color is our R1 low density residential zone. It covers about 80% of our residential areas and is the place where most of the changes due to House Bill 2001 will take effect. Before single-family zoning was vastly expanded after World War II, American neighborhoods contained a mix of single houses and other types of housing. By now, many of us are familiar with the term missing middle housing, coined by Daniel Paralak of Opticos Design. Housing that falls between a single detached unit and an apartment is called missing middle or just middle housing. The House bill defined middle housing to include duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, cottage clusters, and townhouses. Top 3 pictures on this slide are from left to right, Eugene examples of middle housing: a fourplex, a duplex, and townhomes. So middle housing isn't a new concept. It can be found in many older neighborhoods and historic districts, as well as in newer mixed housing neighborhoods. But until HB 2001, new middle housing was difficult to build, only allowed in certain places, requiring special permits, public hearings, and discretionary approval processes. Once cities implement the bill, middle housing will be allowed by right in most large city neighborhoods. Here are some definitions of the types of middle housing. A duplex is 2 units on a lot. A triplex is 3. A fourplex, or sometimes called a quadplex, is 4. A cottage cluster is a grouping of no fewer than 4 detached dwellings per acre with a footprint of less than 900 square feet each that includes a common courtyard. And lastly, the townhouses, 2 or more attached dwellings where each dwelling is located on an individual lot or parcel and shares at least one common wall with an adjacent dwelling. So a little bit about our project timeline and how it's different than our other projects. This one is big. It is different and it's fast. Our typical projects are city council directed, meaning that there's support from and direction coming down from our local decision makers. This project is coming from the state, and city staff are working to implement it. That dynamic presented a unique challenge. Although this bill was passed in 2019, the project didn't kick off until early 2020, which means that the vast majority of the public engagement and project work has occurred over Zoom due to the pandemic. Lastly, 2 years is the blink of an eye in planning time. We've had to move quickly while ensuring we do things right in very unusual circumstances. At the state level, the House bill rulemaking process involved a lot of different groups and a lot of different products. It was directed by the Department of Land Conservation and Development, and those staff formed a rules advisory committee consisting of 23 members from around the state from different perspectives and stakeholder groups, a technical advisory committee with 25 members and technical expertise in various subjects. They held 9 meetings and ultimately developed a set of minimum standards for cities to comply with and a model code. Those documents were adopted by the Land Conservation and Development Commission at the end of 2020. And now I'm going to pass it over to Sophie to tell you about our public involvement process.
Great, thank you, Terry. So this is just an overview of some components of our public involvement process. If you'd like to see more detail about the public involvement plan, I'm happy to put a link to that in the chat. The public involvement plan was approved in summer of 2020 by the Planning Commission. And because it came at kind of a weird time with the pandemic, everything was very Zoom centric. I'll just give an overview of these components. So one of them was the Boards and Commissions Roundtable, and the lists of the groups that you see here come directly from the public involvement plan. So we had representatives from several boards and commissions. They held 3 meetings. One was focused on developing guiding values and principles for the project. One was focused on a technical recommendation, and then one was focused on an affordability-centric recommendation. And this word cloud came from one of their meeting summaries. Then we had a local partners roundtable. It was kind of like the counterpart to the boards and commissions roundtable. They also held 3 meetings focused on the exact same thing with a very similar but different word cloud. And their last meeting, they met together with the boards and commissions roundtable. Then a new thing that we tried this year was we had an equity roundtable, and the equity roundtable held 5 meetings. It was staffed by Alai Community Consulting, and it consisted of representatives from local organizations or nonprofits that serve underrepresented communities, and participants were compensated for their time. So this was hoping to create an equity focus on the project. And we're really excited about that work and acknowledge that although it wasn't all encompassing, it was a step in the right direction. So looking forward to doing more there. Another aspect that we had was our Healthy Democracy lottery selected panel. Healthy Democracy is a Portland-based nonprofit that focuses on running deliberative democracy processes. We sent out 7,500 invitations to random households all around Eugene. And then from that, used an algorithm to select 29 random Eugenians from all over the city with all different experiences. They met 15 total times. They used their first 10 meetings to establish shared background knowledge, and then from there made their recommendations. So it's this really iterative, deliberative process, and really exciting to see that happen. They were also compensated for their time, and I'll go over a few exciting things from their demographics. So we had 8 of the Healthy Democracy panelists under the age of 25. We don't usually see a lot of younger people involved in our processes. We had representation from all city wards, including from unincorporated areas. 1 in 6 panelists identified as having a disability. Almost half of the panelists rent their homes. The panel included multiple gender identities. We also used local school age demographics from the 4J and Bethel school data because those demographics are more diverse than our general population. And because this is a long range planning project, that's the generation that we're actually going to affect with the work that we're doing. And then lastly, educational attainment on the panel ranged from no high school diploma to advanced degrees. Then we had a community-wide survey. This was hosted on the city's online engagement platform, Engage Eugene. It received 741 responses after being open for about a month. 11 of those responses were in Spanish. Although we couldn't have in-person surveys, we did offer the opportunity to print surveys and had PDF versions as well. Then another aspect of the project is that we partnered with the University of Oregon's Planning, Public Policy and Management undergraduate Real World Eugene class. This class partners really great students with the university to do real world work. And so we had a group of 4 students conduct focus groups and receive 137 student surveys about middle housing. So that was awesome. Then we had one of those students stay on to be an intern, and he, along with another intern, developed a Gen Z GIS story map. So they made a very technical map about middle housing, accessible to the Gen Z generation. So that was great. We also decided to really go virtual since it was during the pandemic. So we did a lot of social media outreach. Our handle is @HugePlanning on every platform that we're on. On Instagram, we started from scratch really in August of 2019, I want to say. Now we're up to 743 followers. I think it's 745 as of today, but not that I check. And then there's been 49 middle housing project posts. And so we've really tried to have a presence there. I hope that some of you found out about this event through our Instagram. Then of course we have our Facebook that has identical posts as our Instagram that has almost 1,000 followers. And there we also hosted 5 Facebook Live events about the connection of the middle housing project to larger topics. So we hosted one on climate, social justice and equity, communicating with Gen Z, economics, and transportation and transit. Lastly, I wanted to talk about Reddit. This is an online discussion forum, and we did a Q&A forum called an Ask Me Anything in the Eugene channel or page, and that had over 100 engagements. So that was great. And here's a graphic that you can't possibly read entirely over Zoom. Luckily, it's available on our webpage for you to zoom into and check it out. Just some engagement by the numbers of this project. So now, after doing all of this great engagement, I wanted to talk a little bit about the technical aspects of our proposed code recommendations, which is where we are now as we approach the adoption process. So after we heard from all of those groups and they developed their guiding values and principles for the project, one of the main themes was to go beyond what was required from the bill. So you may recall that Terry mentioned that the state created minimum standards. So that basically set a floor for what communities had to do to be in compliance with the bill. Then they created a model code, and that model code meets the minimum standards, but exceeds it in some cases. And so that kind of modeled an approach that communities could take. We came up with 3 things we could do. We could either allow, which was meet the minimum standards, encourage, which was exceed them to remove barriers to middle housing, or incentivize and exceed them even more and do even more to remove barriers and lower the cost of middle housing. So anything that's attached to incentivize is to hopefully lower the cost of the housing. The Equity Roundtable, Healthy Democracy Panel, Boards and Commissions Roundtable, Local Partners Roundtable, and Survey all agreed, the majority all agreed to go beyond the minimum standards of the bill. This graph that you see on this slide shows that 82% of survey respondents wanted us to go beyond the minimum standards. So it was awesome that we heard so much agreement that this is the path that we should take, and that's how we proceeded. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about highlights of the proposed code. I just want to say that because I'm summarizing this at a high level, it's not all encompassing. We just published yesterday this awesome guide to the adoption process that has a code summary in it. And even that summary is summarized. And so just to make our legal team happy, we cannot possibly cover everything today. And we're happy to point you to the official code documents. But one of the components is that the proposed code allows plexes, so duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes to be attached and detached. And so this is an example that comes straight from the state showing 2 variations of this. The one on the left is an attached duplex, and the one on the right is a detached duplex. And so the definitions of these plexes end up being just, how the number of units on a lot, no matter how they look. Then I wanted to touch a little bit on lot size. And so for single detached dwellings, which is also just another way of saying single family dwellings, although we're switching to single detached dwelling to comply with state law that no longer allows us to use the word family in our code. So nothing is changing with those. So already the proposed minimum lot size for single detached dwellings is 4,500 square feet, and that's going to stay the same. Duplexes are proposed to be 2,250 square feet. Triplexes are proposed to be 3,500 square feet. Fourplexes are proposed to be 4,500 square feet. Townhomes don't have a minimum lot size. And then cottage clusters are 4,500 square feet. Then there's building height. And so right now, the maximum building height for a single detached dwelling is 30 feet. And the recommendation is to raise that to 35 feet for duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters. Then I wanted to talk a little bit about parking. So right now for single detached dwellings, you have to provide 1 space per dwelling unit. So that would be 1 space total. For duplexes, we're proposing 1 space for dwelling unit, so 2 spaces total. And then for triplexes, there's a range, and it basically depends on lot size. And this may look a little funny, but it comes straight from the state's minimum standards. And so that's what we base this off of. So for lots under 3,000 square feet, you would have 1 space per lot. So it's 1 space total. Or you'd be required to build 1 space. You could build more if you wanted to. For lots between 3,000 square feet and 4,999 square feet, you'd have to have 2 spaces per lot. And then lots over 5,000 square feet, 3 spaces per lot. And then we have parking continued. Fourplexes are that exact same arrangement as the triplexes. And so it goes based off of lot size with maximum 4 spaces per lot. For townhouses and cottage clusters, it goes back down to 1 space per dwelling unit total. But because we heard from our community involvement to incentivize, where the proposed code also proposes some parking reductions. And so no off-street parking is required if middle housing is close to transit, and we're defining close at 0.25, so a quarter mile from frequent transit routes. We're also allowing on-street parking credits to contribute to the off-street parking requirements. And then to try to incentivize smaller units, which in theory would be more affordable, no off-street parking is required for each middle housing dwelling unit that is small, so less than 900 square feet. And then if you also have small units, the minimum lot size may be reduced by 25%. And so that's just hoping, again, to incentivize those smaller, more affordable units. As I mentioned, we have a guide to the adoption process. It went live on our website yesterday. This is just a sneak peek at it. It has some project background, it has the code summaries, and then it has some details for how to get involved in the public hearings process and provide your input. And I'll provide a link to that in the chat after we're done. In the code summary tables within the guide, I just wanted to review how to read them because there's a lot of information in there. As I said, it's kind of hard to summarize code. So this is an example straight from the guide, and it shows the minimum lot size for a triplex. On the far left is the minimum standard that comes straight from the Oregon Administrative Rules language. Then we have the middle column, which is the language from the model code. So as I said, the language from the model code meets the minimum standards, but in some cases it exceeds it. Then on the far right, we have Eugene's proposed R1 standard. And so here you can see that the minimum standard for lot size for the triplex is 5,000 square feet. The model code says that that minimum lot size must be the same as single detached dwellings in the same zone. So that would be 4,500 square feet. And then on the right, you see our proposed standard, which is 3,500 square feet. And then it says if it's less or more than the minimum standard. So here we see encourage for the 3,500 square feet, since that goes beyond the minimum standard. But then we also see incentivize, and in parentheses, it says lot size requirements reduced by 25% if the triplex is composed of small, less than 900 square foot average units. So it shows that in some cases we have allow, encourage, incentivize, or a mix of them depending on the conditions. So that's a lot for me. I'm now going to hand it over to Jen to talk a little bit about what all of this could look like. And I'm going to temporarily stop my screen share and pull up this awesome graphic.
Okay, thank you, Sophie. So what this graphic illustrates is possible building scenarios for different kinds of building types. It's what's the standard now and potentially what the proposed standard is. These are on typical 60 by 120 foot lots. That's about 7,200 square foot lots, just to give you some perspective. That's fairly common in Eugene. So the example A is if someone chose to build out to the maximum potential that is allowed for a single family home. So the setbacks are 5 feet on each side, and a rear setback of 5 feet and 10-foot setback in the front. And those aren't proposed to change between the different kinds of building types. So this footprint is 3,600 square feet. It's allowed to go up to 30 feet in height, at which point then if you provide a sloped peaked roof, you can go up to 37 feet at the peak. It's allowed 50% coverage. Scenario B, is the maximum build out that's being proposed for a plex in the encourage and incentivize. So the maximum build out for the attached plex without parking, so that would be near transit. The setbacks would be the same, and they account for about 27% of the lot. So even though what's being proposed is 75% lot coverage, this scenario actually couldn't get quite to 75% coverage. So it's approximately 5,250 square feet. The proposed height would be 35 feet up to where the roof pitch starts. And so then it could go up an additional 7 feet, like the single family, up to a maximum height of 42 feet at the peak. Scenario C is more common to what we see as far as single family dwellings. It's approximately 1,830 square foot footprint. It's approximately 29 feet in height, has a 30% lot coverage plus a detached garage. And then scenario D would be maximum build out for a quadplex that would have the required parking. So that would be 4 parking spaces for a quadplex. So the maximum footprint that you could really get if you're accommodating parking is 2,190 square feet. And that's 30% lot coverage. And if you can scroll down a bit, we can look at the what that looks like from the backyard. And so you can see that just adding parking really affects the amount of coverage that a building footprint can accommodate. And so that would be not near transit.
Cool. Thank you, Jen. And if you'd like to explore what middle housing could look like that's already existing in our neighborhood, Jen also made a great missing middle handbook, and we can provide a link to that as well. And now we will hand it over to Jeff to talk about middle housing land divisions.
Thanks, Sophie. Yeah, so this was a separate Senate bill that came out following the passage of House Bill 2001 called Senate Bill 458, which is a little clunky, so we call it middle housing land divisions. And middle housing land divisions are a kind of a new type of land division that's being required to be implemented by the state. And so we're applying that locally. And essentially what it's intended to do is to create more opportunities for home ownership when it comes to middle housing specifically. So that's duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, cottage clusters, and the like. And specifically, this does not apply to ADUs. I want to make that very clear. This is for middle housing. And what it allows you to do is essentially, when you develop middle housing on a lot, it allows you to draw lines along the lot that allow you to transfer property ownership and essentially divide that lot into separate pieces so that those can be sold off. And so just really quickly, as examples at the bottom of this slide, you'll see on the left is a duplex, and the purple lines kind of show the existing lot. And if the homeowner decided they wanted to sell off one of the units of the duplex, you could draw the dashed line in red and you'd be able to sell that piece off. And the same thing for the cottage cluster shown on the right. Each one of those cottages could be put on its own lot and sold off separately. There are some provisions within the middle housing land divisions, which you see in the bolded list, which show that each lot that you create through a middle housing land division must result in exactly one dwelling on a lot. They all have to have separate utilities. There have to be easements for things like pedestrian access, access to the units, common areas, driveways, parking, things like that. All of the buildings have to meet the building code. And then the development code standards apply still to the main lot. And what that means is that, and this is something that there's been a lot of confusion around, is that for example, on that duplex, that you see below, the purple lines, the what we would call the parent lot, the main lot, you still have to meet all of the development standards and the lot standards. It has to be of a certain size. You have to meet setbacks and things like that. The purple lines, you have to meet all those standards for that. And then when you're drawing lines within the purple box for sale purposes, that's when you don't have to meet necessarily things like interior yard setback or lot size or lot frontage, some of those typical standards that we require for what you see on the purple lots. And so if you go to the next slide, this is kind of a good example of what you could see with a fourplex development. So on the left, you can see that it'd be a fourplex with some parking in the rear and access along the street that's at the bottom of the screen there. And on the right-hand side, you can see that they, you could have this version of the quadplex, you could develop it that way, and then come in later and you could draw these pink lines. And essentially those pink lines would allow each unit to be sold off individually to new homeowners. And you also see some pink shaded areas. That's where you would need access easements. And then each one has to have its own utilities. But like I said before, the outside boundaries of the parent lot, the original lot, those you still have to meet applicable setbacks. You have to meet the frontage standards. You have to meet all of the normal development standards for that parent lot. It's just when you're creating those child lots, you don't necessarily have to meet those when you're just drawing those lines. So with that, I think here's just a middle housing lot size map. Again, just to demonstrate across Eugene what the lot sizes look like when you think about where middle housing is proposed to be allowed. So duplexes on lots that are 2,250 square feet, triplexes on 3,500 square feet, and quadplexes on lots that are 4,500 square feet, which you see in green, which covers most of the map here. And just as a note, this map doesn't take into account whether lots are developed or these aren't the vacant lots around town. These are just all residential lots throughout Eugene. So with that, I will move to the next slide, which I think I'm handing it back to Sophie at this point.
I'm going to come in right here, actually. Yeah, we made a change just to keep you on your toes, Jeff. So we have heard a lot about housing affordability throughout this process. We heard it from every outreach group. We heard it from the Planning Commission and from the community in general. So to help with that, the team prepared a new affordability FAQ, which is on our website, and it answers some of the most frequently asked questions about housing affordability. The top question is, can we require new middle housing to be affordable? And the answer is no, we can't do that because that would be a requirement that doesn't apply to single detached dwellings. And the main goal of the House bill is to bring middle housing to the same level playing field as single detached dwellings. However, there are things that we can do to encourage lower cost housing. And some of those things are on this list. The city can allow smaller lots, reduce parking requirements because parking costs a lot, offer density bonuses for owners who choose to keep some units affordable, and reduce city fees and property taxes for middle housing. We're still in the process of exploring some of these options, but the top two are wrapped into the draft code that we're discussing right now. Next slide. This is a chart that we borrowed from the Lane County Affordable Housing Action Plan. And I know it's hard to see, but it will be in the PowerPoint that we share, and you can find it on the Lane County website if you want to look sooner. The blue box shows example households of a couple earning minimum wage who could afford monthly housing costs, and this is about a year old now, of $1,250. And the other example family is a logging equipment operator who can afford $1,400 in monthly housing costs. The estimated rent and affordability range of what the different options of allow, encourage, and incentivize can produce is shown along the bottom of this slide. The incentivized code package, which has the smallest lots and least requirements, can produce housing affordable to people earning 71 to 89% of area median income. So while these code amendments can't produce the lowest income housing, they can help us establish a set of land use rules that encourage lower cost rental homes and lower cost homes for purchase, especially with the implementation of the middle housing lot divisions under Senate Bill 458, which really allows homeownership of smaller, typically more affordable units than larger single detached units. Oh, one final note on this slide is that at the top, we've added a note that says new single detached dwellings, affordability range is off the charts. And I think we've all seen ads for new single family detached dwellings that are well above 450 and start really in the 300s for most neighborhoods in Eugene. Next slide. Back to Sophie for how to learn more.
Thank you, Terry. This is a screenshot of our middle housing webpage. It's eugene-or.gov/middle housing, all one word. And it has a ton of resources on it. There you can see that you can click on the guide to the adoption process. You can sign up to receive formal mailed notice about the public hearings process. You can also sign up through that same link to get informal emails about the project. There's also an Engage Eugene page where we hosted the survey. However, that's a little less active these days, although still updated. There's a ton of consultant work products on the page. There's FAQs, there's fact sheets, there's videos. So I encourage you to check it out. There's a ton of resources on there. And what is coming now? So the big date that we are promoting is the Planning Commission public hearing is on November 16th at 5:30 p.m. And we're hoping that after that, the Planning Commission makes their recommendation to City Council by the end of the calendar year. Then in early 2022, the City Council will have their public hearing. We don't yet have a date for that, but we will share it widely when we do. And then they need to make their decision and have action prior to June 30th, 2022. If they delay their action to after June 30th, 2022, the model code would automatically apply. And of course, we want to hear from you. So there's a variety of ways of doing that. You can email this email address, middlehousingtestimony@eugene-or.gov. All of that will go into the record for the middle housing project. So that's an easy way. You can also email the Olive Planning Commission by sending an email to planningcommissioners@eugene-or.gov. And you can email the mayor and city council at mayor, council, and city manager@eugene-or.gov. And you can provide public testimony, spoken if you would like to, at the Planning Commission and City Council. And so the first opportunity to do that would be November 16th at 5:30 p.m. for the Planning Commission. And we have a lot of opportunities to learn more. So I've already promoted the guide to the adoption process. We're hoping that's a one-stop shop. But if you want even more middle housing, you can go to eugene-or.gov/middle housing. You can also sign up for the email list or formal notice. I've created a tiny URL for that. It's tinyurl.com/mh-emails. One just went out yesterday. And staff loves talking to people in the community and answering your questions. And so a good place to start is by emailing me. And if I'm not the person to email, I probably know who to pass it on to. So I'm happy to do that. And then I'm going to hand it over to Jeff before we open it up for questions to cover some questions that we heard at our first information session, which was on Tuesday.
Thanks, Sophie. Yeah, so again, I encourage everybody to start typing your questions into the chat, and we can start kind of collecting those and getting ready to respond to them. And just I did note that we have one person joining by phone, so we'll open it up towards the end for people to ask questions live. Without typing those in the chat, but I did see that one person was attending by phone. So yeah, so at our last meeting, we had a couple conversations come up, and some helpful people called me and asked for clarifications, and those were clarifications that I thought would be nice to give to everybody. So the first one is tree preservation. So there's within our draft code amendments, we are proposing to apply an exemption for the Chapter 9 tree preservation standards and expanding that to include middle housing. Right now, it only applies to lots that are below 20,000 square feet and are developed with a single family home or a duplex. And we're planning on expanding that to include also tracts that are going to be developed with middle housing as well. And Eugene's tree preservation standards that exist within Chapter 9, the land use chapter, requires a certified arborist to essentially, when they're proposing to remove trees, they have to consider the impact of removing those trees and provide that information to staff. I will note that the lots over 20,000 square feet, that they can remove 5 trees annually without going through that process as well. So it's really, I think people are primarily concerned with the fact that lots under 20,000 square feet can be developed with middle housing without having to meet the Chapter 9 tree preservation standards. That being said, I don't want to overlook the fact that Eugene has a lot of chapters. Obviously, the land use code chapter is Chapter 9. Chapter 6 of our land use code, which does apply at the time of building permit, does also have tree preservation and removal standards. Those are not proposed to be changed. Those limit people based on the number of trees that they can remove. It requires tree removal permits if you're going to remove more than what you'd be allowed to normally. So I just want to call out that those standards still do exist. So moving on to solar setbacks. This is probably one of the most nuanced pieces of code that we have in the land use code. And what solar setbacks are intended to do is to protect access to sunlight, right? So if somebody's going to come in and build a new development, is that new development going to shade another property or limit their ability to receive sunlight? And solar setbacks essentially apply to require a building to be set back from the other property in such a way that it wouldn't, cast shade onto that property. And those solar setbacks apply in very, very specific circumstances. And it's essentially applied in those cases where it's most likely that the sun would be blocked by new buildings. So it applies to anything on lots 4,000 square feet or more. And it applies to lots where there's more than 75 feet wide on the north-south axis, which is kind of the really confusing part for most folks. So essentially it says that if your lot meets those standards, then your building has to be developed in such a way and placed on the lot in such a way that it cannot shade the property to the north of you. So if you want to stop sharing really quickly, I can share my screen briefly, which has a little graphic that I threw together at the last minute. So I apologize for the last minute nature of this. Move those out of the way. So here you'll see that this is kind of what the solar setback does. You can see that it's requiring this building to be located far enough away from this building so that it doesn't cast shade over the entire structure. And you can see that kind of reflected in the same way down here. So like I said, it's on lots that are greater than 4,000 square feet, zoned R1 or R2 with a north-south dimension of more than 75 feet. There are exceptions for this, such as slopes, existing shade, if your neighbor says it's okay, or if insignificant benefit, like if you're going to shade a street, that's okay, or if you get it approved through a separate development. So I put together a little graphic here that kind of tries to illustrate this with I just chose a random spot in Eugene. So this top lot here, if you were to develop or expand this house, it does have a north-south dimension of more than 75 feet. So those setbacks would apply, except you can see that they're going to shade a road. So that's one of those exceptions that would apply. This person, they've got a very long lot, but it's only 70 feet wide on the north-south axis. So those solar setbacks wouldn't apply in that case. And then in this case, on the bottom one, it's 160 feet on the north-south. And so in this case, they would be shading this property to the north of them. So solar setbacks would be applied, and they would have to go through that process to make sure that they don't shade out those properties. So I'm going to stop my sharing there and move on to the next question. So like I said, that's a pretty nuanced one. If anybody wants to follow up with me directly on those solar standards, I'm happy to talk about those more. The third bullet here is development on narrow or substandard streets. So there's kind of two questions here. One is, can you develop middle housing on a lot that has a narrow or a substandard street? And the answer is yes, so long as it is annexed into the city and it meets all of the other development standards, lot standards, things like that. You can develop on a street that is narrow or substandard. But then the question comes to on-street parking. So as Sophie mentioned earlier, you can get on-street parking credits when you have parking available to you. There is a provision within that section that says you cannot claim an on-street parking standard or an on-street parking space, essentially eliminating your need to provide parking on site if you're on a street that does not meet the width standards for City of Eugene streets, or if you're located on a street that's not owned or within the City of Eugene. So if you're on, for example, some of those properties out in the Santa Clara or River Road neighborhoods, when that street might be a Lane County right-of-way technically, you wouldn't be able to claim that on-street parking credit. And then the last one is CC&Rs, covenants, conditions, and restrictions. These are private recorded documents that exist on a piece of property that are implemented on a property by property basis. They're not implemented by the city. But when they passed House Bill 2001, they recognized that these covenants, conditions, and restrictions that exist on properties, they're a recorded document that can say a lot of different things. And one of those things it could say is this lot can only ever be developed with a single family house. And if your CC&Rs were put in place prior to the adoption of House Bill 2001, that CC&R can stand and you would not be able to develop so long as with a piece of middle housing, if it said that you can't develop middle housing, so long as it was recorded and in place prior to HB 2001. If you went in today and you tried to record a CC&R that said no middle housing is allowed on my lot, that could not be applied. The state specifically called out that that's not all. You can't retroactively try to mitigate the development of middle housing on a piece of property. So through the CC&R's property process. So with that, I think we're going to turn our actual questions here. And I see that we have some clarifications from Terry. Let's see, I apologize as I'm reading here.
I did put this in the chat. Feel free to put on your camera if you would like to. We get sick of looking at ourselves all day.
Yeah, so there's a comment in the chat from Mary, and she mentioned that, let's see, I'm sorry, I just lost it here. She said, not having off-street parking won't discourage people from having cars. It just means that they park on local streets, which is proving to be a problem, for example, around the Echo Apartments on River Road. So this is true, people will still have cars. And I just want to clarify that we're not eliminating parking requirements, but there are opportunities to use incentives to not have to have off-site or off-street, on-site parking, such as being close to transit or when those on-street parking credits are available. That won't happen in all cases. I will call out that the Echo apartments are not middle housing, so those parking standards still do apply to, that'd be what's called a multi-unit development. Basically, when it's 5 or more units, then it's a multi-unit development. And those parking requirements will apply to those still. There's different incentives for parking reductions through that, but I just want to clarify that parking is still required in most cases, unless you're near transit or you can benefit from one of the on-street parking credits.
And Jeff, if I could just add to that,
Yeah.
the case is pretty unique in River Road, Santa Clara because of the number of unannexed properties. And so the middle housing standards in general will not apply until properties annex. And so that becomes an issue over time as the area urbanizes and gets added to the city. But new development for middle housing would have to annex first. And then on top of that, if there is no developed street parking, it wouldn't be eligible for a credit like Jeff had already explained. And the last thing I'll say about this is, of course, all of these comments are welcome. Parking has been a big topic of discussion at all of the Planning Commission meetings. And there are a variety of different ways that it could be handled. So definitely include your comments to the Planning Commission.
I see a question from Mary that's asking why developers would develop middle housing when they could instead make more money building high-end single-family homes. And I'll post the chat along with the recording later on the web page. And I just had a link ready for this one. So the answer is that developers can and still will build single detached dwellings. So we actually had some consultants, let me put this link in the chat. Some consultants do feasibility analysis, seeing what the development potential would be of middle housing along with single detached dwellings. And the effects of this project really are going to be incremental because they rely on infill and they also rely on the market. And so we'll still be seeing single detached dwellings being built. The second part of the question is, where are the incentives for them? What are the economics on the ground? And so I'm hopeful that PDF that I put in the chat helps answer the question about the economics on the ground. But as far as incentives for them, we're hoping that by allowing the development on smaller lot sizes and not requiring parking, which then hopefully allows projects to pencil out better, will encourage development of middle housing. And then, as Terry mentioned, the team is still exploring alternative methods of encouraging more affordable middle housing and incentivizing developers. So that's in the works. And Terry, if you have anything to add to that, please feel free.
That is what I was going to say. So I don't think I need to add much other than to say we're kind of considering what affordability levels those incentives would be at and trying to get feedback from both market rate and affordable housing developers on the feasibility of offering that incentive. So that's a little bit behind because it's not a requirement of the House bill. So we concentrated first on getting all of the code pieces done that were required to implement the bill. And now we're having a chance to catch up with what we could do in addition to that in terms of incentives. So yeah, that's in the works.
And I'll since I don't see another active question in the chat just yet, I'll expand on that just a little bit more by saying that House Bill 2001 is really intended to allow for more middle housing throughout the community. And one of the biggest barriers that had previously, or that exists in the code currently as it stands, is that middle housing, that means triplexes, quadplexes, cottage clusters. You either have to go through an extensive land use process or you have to meet what's known currently as the multifamily standards. And the multifamily standards are a very intense set of regulations that are meant to govern the development of garden style apartment buildings, which would be, what you imagine when you see a large apartment complex with buildings that have 4, 5, 6, 10, 20 units in them. And so when you try to apply those standards to triplexes and quadplexes, it really sets up large barriers for that development. So through this process of setting a new set of standards for middle housing explicitly, that process is really breaking down some of those big barriers to the development of middle housing throughout Eugene.
Jeff, I just saw another question in the chat that seems perfect for you to answer. It's regarding the solar setbacks. And Lynn is asking, could developers get out from requirements, the solar setback requirements, by cleverly subdividing so that lot width is under 75 feet?
Yeah, so Lynn, there are ways to subdivide so that solar setbacks don't apply at this stage of building permitting. However, in addition to the solar setbacks that apply at the time that you're building a structure, there are what's called solar lot standards. And so when you're going through the subdivision process, you also have to go through this process to demonstrate that you're not creating a situation that will leave nobody with any light. And I'll post a link to those standards in the chat. I'm not going to dive into those because they are, again, very nuanced and detailed. So unless you all want a real technical analysis, that'll take up the next 45 minutes. I don't think I'll do that.
Then I'm seeing another question from Pam. Had you considered going with minimal House Bill 2001 requirements, so the minimum standards, and then using an affordable housing overlay, such as being done in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to incentivize affordable housing?
I'll take that one. Thanks for the tip. We'll look into what Cambridge, Mass is doing. I haven't heard about that, but what I will say is that as the rules were being developed and House Bill 2001 was going through the rulemaking process, there were affordable housing experts, providers of affordable housing on that rulemaking committee. And so a lot of what ended up in the rules was because of their input in the process. So developers from both affordable housing perspective and market rate perspective were involved in that rulemaking. We do have pretty prescriptive parameters around how to handle that. There is also a piece of House Bill 2001 that requires cities to consider affordability strategies, all of which we already do. And so there are programs throughout the city of Eugene that apply to all kinds of housing, not just middle housing. And the last plug that I'll give is for an ongoing project called the Housing Implementation Pipeline, which is a citywide project handled by our Community Development Division and that Council just heard about on October 13th in their work session. This includes things like exploring different kinds of home buying assistance, different kinds of rental assistance and rental protections, anti-gentrification and displacement strategies for the city as a whole, because the housing system is very complex and we need different partners and different tools to tackle different parts of the issue.
All right, I don't see any other questions in the chat. I will open it up. I know we still have one person joining us by phone. I want to give them a chance if you can raise your hand if you would like to talk by dialing *9. So if you'd like to ask us a question over the phone, you can go ahead and do so.
And we also welcome hearing your voices in the room. If you wanted to raise your hand and ask us a question, it could be about the code, it could be about how to provide public involvement, anything like that. I've learned over Zoom to wait like 5 more seconds than is comfortable. Oh, I saw another question from Lynn in the chat. How has the trend to convert existing middle housing into Airbnb been considered? Or short-term rentals would be the term we'd use for that. Carrie, did you want to grab that? Maybe Jeff?
Yeah, Jeff might have something to add. I know that Council did take up the issue of short-term rentals earlier this year, maybe last winter, and landed on not requiring any additional regulations. So it's a thing where middle housing would need to be treated the same as other forms of housing in our community. You know any more, Jeff?
No, that's about all I know at this point as well, that it's not something we've been directed to get into the code, or that anybody's had any focused requests to do.
They are required to register now. That was a change out of that council session. So they're being, it's being tracked. That's kind of the first step.
Thanks, Jen.
I see another question in the chat from a resident. Is there a map of where middle housing will be encouraged?
I think the lot size map that we showed earlier in the presentation is the best one to get a sense of where across the city middle housing will be allowed by code. The question of where it will be encouraged is a complicated one, but I will say that the direction and the overall outcome of the outreach that we've done to date has wanted to encourage middle housing equitably across the city. And so the approach that the code takes is treating all areas and all neighborhoods of the city the same. Anything to add?
I would just say that some of the incentives, such as parking reductions and things like that, also exist within the frequent transit corridors map that is attached to the proposed draft code. That's another area to look at. That's essentially, like was mentioned in the presentation, a quarter mile from transit, frequent transit lines. Also, so those areas are receiving kind of an additional benefit. So it could be that as encouraged.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm going to use this opportunity to launch a poll. We're trying to see what methods of communication are working best and where we could improve. So I have a poll tonight asking how you heard about this information session. So if you are so inclined, we would love to hear from you. We're also welcoming suggestions for what we could do better or differently, or what went well. We're doing this at least one more time, Tuesday, October 26th from 7 to 8:30 p.m. You could come again if you'd like, but we're covering the exact same stuff. But there will be another opportunity to ask questions, or if you just really want to spend your evening talking about middle housing, we'll be here. So please feel free to give us feedback. We want to know how to best reach the community. Great, I'm seeing a lot of folks heard from their neighborhood association, from city staff, social media, other. If you clicked other and you want to share in the chat how you heard, love to hear that, no pressure. And the mailing list, awesome.
Oh, nice. You can add that to the poll for next time. So I did see a question from Pam, which is asking about how detached units, so detached units could preserve more trees, asking for someone to explain how that could be possible. And really it's all around site flexibility that comes from allowing detached units. If you have a site that has existing trees on it and you're inclined to preserve those trees for one reason or another, because people like trees generally speaking. But if you're required to have your units attached, it may make the design of those buildings really tough to fit them into one area or another if there's a tree in the middle of a lot. Whereas if you allowed a detached plex of some kind, whether that be a duplex, triplex, or quadplex, it would give you the flexibility to site the structures around or with mitigating impacts to those trees that are on the site. I don't know if that's was the intended logic of the comment that you referenced, but that would be where my brain goes.
Did that come through? I tried to share the poll. Can people see it? Yeah, okay, cool. Then it'll be part of the recording. Yay. Hopefully.
Oh.
Oh, I see one
So-
about Senate Bill 458. Do you see that, Jeff?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, Joshua asked if attached units qualify for division into small child lots or only detached. So this is a question about the middle housing land division, and whether or not you can, like I said, draw little lots around individual units to be able to sell those off. And that applies to detached middle housing. It applies to attached middle housing. The only type of middle housing that you wouldn't be able to do the middle housing land division is a stacked plexus. So if you've got one duplex unit on the bottom floor and the next one on top of it, if you imagine drawing lines on the ground, you'd be drawing lines in the sky. So that's not something that you could do for stacked plexus, but it does apply to all other versions, attached or detached, for middle housing. Let's see. Do you spot any other? I see some comments, but I don't necessarily see questions at this point.
Again, feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to ask your question. Oh, see, I didn't wait an uncomfortable enough amount of time. We have another question from Joshua. Will there be any requirements for shared agreements for those child lots?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you go through that process, there's going to be not only agreements from a private perspective to ensure that everybody has, their rights protected for things like access and utilities and things like that. But there's also going to be a requirement that essentially is recorded onto the property itself. That's part of our proposal that states that the existing parent lot is one parent lot that contains a quadplex. And so or a duplex, triplex, or whatever, but essentially the goal of that is to ensure that when you're creating these child lots, each individual unit that you're creating within that parent lot, that's not a new single family home. That's one unit within a quadplex. Even though it's on its own saleable lot, it's still, one piece of a whole.
And
so,
Jeff, would that be recorded on a property's deed typically?
Yeah, so it'd be recorded as an agreement so that when folks go to buy a home and you get a title report or something like that, this would be one of those documents that would come up so that people would go, oh, I'm buying one unit within a larger whole. Because that's one of the things that we find to be really important so that people understand what they're buying. So that's something where we said, hey, we're going to add just this additional piece of data into the system to make sure that that's understood.
Okay.
And I guess I'll just elaborate a little further on that, which is that because each one of those units is one unit of a greater piece of middle housing, each unit doesn't get its own ADU, for example, because an ADU is something that it's accessory to or subordinate to a single detached dwelling, and it cannot be subordinate to a piece of middle housing. And so you wouldn't be able to get an ADU on one of those child lots. Those lots would only be allowed one unit of the piece of middle housing. Josh I'm just going to continue talking to Josh right now. It could get complicated with maintenance units for attached pieces. However, just for reference, this is something that currently exists. We currently have the ability to do duplex divisions, and what it requires is essentially a maintenance agreement between the property owners. So when you go through this process, there's a standard agreement that people sign that basically says you share responsibility for those things. So that's covered in the maintenance agreements. And while I'm on that train of thought, we currently do have this duplex division allowance. It's a rather intensive partitioning process. So it's there's a lot of costs associated with it and also a lot of time. And so one thing that Eugene is proposing to do is to allow the middle housing and land divisions to occur both for new middle housing that's going to meet our new middle housing standards for development, but we also are going to allow middle housing land divisions on existing duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, cottage clusters that met whatever standards they met when they built them. So a quadplex that was built 5 years ago and met our pretty intense multifamily standards, they could go in now, or if this is approved, they would be able to use that and say, I met the standards at the time I built this, so I'm going to draw a little lot around each one of my existing units. And we think that's really helpful to promote home ownership on existing and new middle housing.
So I think this is a good kind of related question. It's from Lynn. They ask, a lot of time today was spent on ability to sell small lot housing. Can you describe how middle housing changes will encourage more rental housing to help reduce rental rates? And thank you, Lynn, for asking that question. I think we focus so much on ownership because we're explaining the Senate Bill 458. And one of the things that we heard out of our outreach was to create more ownership opportunities, but absolutely much of middle housing is anticipated to be rental units. And so I'll pass that over to Terry, who I think would be the right person to answer the question.
Yeah, well, I think we heard both things. I think we heard from every outreach group that affordability is a huge problem for both people who rent and people who are trying to own. It doesn't really affect folks who already own a home in our community because they have reaped the benefits of getting into that system whenever they did. So in terms of the need in our community, it is lower income folks, people who are currently renters, and people who are wanting to become homeowners. And like I said before, there's not anything we can do in the code to require a unit to be owned or rented. The city doesn't get into that, but the market can produce homeownership opportunities with some of the tools that are being put in with Senate Bill 458 and the Middle Housing Land Division allowances and requirements. However, our rental rates are over 50% in the community of Eugene, so we know there is a big need to help renters, and there's some other projects going on to help with renter protections and rental assistance programs besides this. We have a lot of renters that rent single family homes. We have renters that live in all kinds of housing. And so that's one of those issues that transcends middle housing. And now I feel like I'm rambling, so I'm going to stop. But I think it's a really good point. Thank you.
I also just put a link in the chat that is from the web page, and it's a document from our consultants on the project from Eco Northwest on the impacts of code scenarios on small rental units. So that would have more quantitative data in that. We have about 15 more minutes for questions. We're just hanging out on Zoom together. I see something from Karen that says units can change from own to rent to own. And I think that's a good point, that even if the middle housing land division is used and units of middle housing are separately owned, they could still be rented out as rental units, similar to how housing is owned and operated today.
I'll just reiterate that if you do want to ask your question live, feel free to unmute yourself and ask that question or type in the chat.
I have a question. I can't figure out how to raise my hand. This is Pam Waddell. I had a question about, there's a lot of these bioswales going in my neighborhood, and I know there's some requirements on some properties that bioswales things have to go in. And then when I look at with the middle housing provision allowing up to 70%, jump from 50 to 70% of the property being able to be covered. I just worry a little bit about, the permeable soil issue and the water protection is how much study of that's gone into this planning. Thank you.
Thanks, Pam. That's a good question. The stormwater standards when you're developing a new piece of a new middle housing or expanding existing middle housing, you're still going to have to demonstrate compliance with all of our stormwater management procedures. So if you are, there's a couple different ways to manage stormwater. One of those is to create a bioswale or a rain garden. And that's a case-by-case basis on whether or not that works on your specific piece of property. So if somebody is going to develop a new piece of middle housing that's going to take up, or have like 70% lot coverage, they'll have to demonstrate exactly how they're complying with their stormwater standards. So that'll be dealt with on a case-by-case basis and how they engineer their stormwater. Thanks for the question. That's a good one.
Yeah, to follow up on that, there's this, I don't know how handy this is. I think it's handy. There's this sheet that developers use when they're looking to develop called the SIM form. It's a simplified approach for stormwater management. And by factoring in a few things like quality, type of the soil, quality of the soil, they see basically how large of what type of facility they'll need for stormwater and how large it will be. And so there will be instances where maximum lot coverage probably wouldn't be able to be achieved. Am I right in saying that, Jeff? Just making sure. So I'll put that there. It's just a bunch of math, just like the solar setbacks. Great question. And I see another one from Christopher, Jeff. They're asking, how is it anticipated to work if the stormwater facility for your roof ends up on someone else's lot after the property is subdivided?
Yeah, absolutely. And Christopher, you can clarify if I'm wrong in this, but I'm assuming you're talking about if your property is subdivided through the middle housing land division. So that case where you're drawing child lots within a parent lot. When you go to develop that lot as a whole, you'll have to demonstrate that the lot and the development of middle housing complies with the stormwater standards. So the units as a whole could have one stormwater detention or retention or system to deal with stormwater, but your little individual unit might not contain any of that, but you'd have to have easements or at least demonstrate at the time of development that you do meet the stormwater standards. Perfect. My assumption was correct.
I'll just note that I put a link into the chat for Eugene's consolidated plan, which is a federal requirement for how we spend dollars on affordable housing and community development projects in Eugene and Springfield, because Karen had a comment about our current community needs, and there's so much information about that out there. But it is summarized in this consolidated plan, which was adopted in 2020 and does have an executive summary. So it might be a place for people to get a sense of our community's needs and the depth of those needs. We're slowly losing participants, but we've still got time.
Yeah, I think so. Karin made a comment that Pam had a good question, and I agree. And it really does talk about the fact that there are lots of other regulations that are in place and do apply to middle housing. The House Bill 2001 allowed us to put in some standards around the design of middle housing, but we still have things like stormwater, utility requirements. Gosh, there's just the building code itself. There's a lot of other standards that still apply and still will provide those kind of mitigating factors from a external off the property that's being developed impacts. So I don't want to forget that those still apply.
Thanks, Karin, and thanks, Jeff. And I'm seeing, I think, some parting words in the chat from a few participants. Just as a reminder, we'll be back next Tuesday, October 26th from 7 to 8:30 to do this again. So tell your friends, tell your neighbors. We would love to answer people's questions and just continue to spread awareness and increase engagement in this project. Thank you for being here. And I think with that, I will stop the recording.